There's a moment, you know it, where a thought walks into your head uninvited, not a decision, not a choice. It just arrives. And for the next few seconds, or minutes, or if you're being honest, hours, you are not driving the car anymore. Something else is. Today I want to talk about that something else. Not to shame it, not to moralize it, but to actually understand it. Because lust isn't just a bodily itch you scratch and forget. It is one of the most powerful state changes consciousness can undergo. It restructures what you notice, what you value, what you remember, and even for a few seconds, who you are. And once you see the mechanics of it, you'll never experience it quite the same way again. Let's get into it. Here's the uncomfortable starting point. Your conscious mind, the I that's narrating your life right now, is not the CEO of your brain. It's more like a press secretary. It shows up after decisions have already been made and explains them, often badly, often after the fact. Nowhere is this more obvious than with desire. Psychologist Robert Sapolsky has this great way of framing it. Most of what feels like you choosing is actually ancient neural circuitry your brain shares with lizards and rats, firing off a decision milliseconds before your prefrontal cortex, your rational executive, even gets the memo. Lust is one of the oldest of these circuits. It doesn't ask permission. It notifies. And here's the key psychological insight. When this circuit activates, it doesn't just add a feeling on top of your normal consciousness. It narrows it. There's a well-documented phenomenon called attentional tunneling. Under high arousal of any kind, fear, hunger, lust, the brain's capacity for peripheral awareness collapses. You stop noticing the room. You stop noticing time. You stop noticing the consequences of what you're about to do. This isn't weakness of character. This is neurochemistry doing exactly what it evolved to do. Eliminate distractions so the organism can pursue the one goal that, evolutionarily speaking, mattered more than almost anything else: reproduction. Dan Ariely, the behavioral economist, actually ran an experiment on this. He had participants answer moral and behavioral questions twice, once in a normal state and once in a state of high arousal. The results weren't subtle. The same person, asked the same question, gave wildly different answers depending on their internal state. Their values didn't change. Their access to their values changed. That's the first big idea I want you to sit with. Lust doesn't corrupt your character. It temporarily reroutes which version of you is in charge. This connects to something philosophers have wrestled with for centuries: the problem of the divided self. Plato had this image, in the Phaedrus, of the soul as a charioteer driving two horses, one noble and obedient, one wild and unruly. The charioteer isn't fighting one battle. He's constantly managing a coalition of forces that don't agree with each other. Sound familiar? Freud, much later, basically formalized this into the id, ego, and superego. The id doesn't negotiate. It doesn't understand later. It doesn't understand consequences. It only understands now, more, yes. Freud thought civilization itself was essentially the ongoing project of restraining this force, which he considered both our engine and our danger. But here's where I want to push back on the purely Freudian, purely repressive framing, because I think it's incomplete. Abraham Maslow had a different take. He didn't see desire as something to be suppressed into submission. He distinguished between what he called D-love and B-love, deficiency love, and being love. D-love is need-based. It's the kind of wanting that comes from emptiness, from lack, from I need this person or this experience to fill something in me. It's grasping. It's often what we mean when we say lust in the reductive sense, an itch, a hunger, a hole to fill. But Maslow argued that as people grow, as they become more psychologically whole, desire doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes less about consuming and more about appreciating. Less I need to have this, and more I am moved by the sheer aliveness of this. That's B-love. And crucially, Maslow's self-actualizing people weren't sexless saints. If anything, he found the opposite. They experienced desire and sensuality more fully, not less, because it wasn't contaminated by anxiety, insecurity, or the need to control. So here's the reframe. Lust isn't the enemy of consciousness. Unintegrated lust is. Let's get concrete, because I don't want this to stay abstract. When arousal spikes, here's what measurably happens to consciousness. 1. Objectification of attention. Neuroscience research on attention shows that under high desire states, the brain shifts from holistic processing, seeing a person as a whole, complex, storied human being, to fetural processing. You start seeing parts instead of a person. This isn't a moral failing you should whip yourself for. It's a documented shift in visual and cognitive process, but it's also exactly why lust, left completely unexamined, can quietly erode intimacy. You can be right next to someone and simultaneously perceptually absent from who they actually are. 2. Time collapse. The prefrontal cortex, which handles future thinking and delayed gratification, goes quiet under high arousal states. This is why in-the-moment decisions and the next morning reflections feel like they were made by two different people. Because, functionally, they kind of were. Different neural networks were dominant in each moment. 3. The depth illusion. This one's fascinating. Intense desire creates a subjective sense of meaning. Everything feels charged, significant, urgent, while simultaneously narrowing your actual awareness. It feels profound while you're in it and often feels hollow the moment it passes. That gap between how meaningful something felt and how meaningful it was is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have, and almost nobody talks about why it happens. It happens because the feeling of significance and actual depth of processing are two separate systems, and arousal juices the first while suppressing the second. Now, I'd be doing this topic a disservice if I only looked at it through the Western lens, Plato, Freud, Maslow, because Eastern contemplative traditions got somewhere very different, and honestly, somewhere I think is more useful. In a lot of Buddhist psychology, desire, tanha, often translated as craving, isn't villainized as sin. It's understood structurally. The teaching isn't wanting is bad. It's wanting, by its very nature, creates suffering. Because it's future-oriented and never satisfied by its own fulfillment. You get what you crave, and within moments, the mind is already reaching for the next thing. The object was never actually the point. The craving structure itself was the point, and it's insatiable by design. This is echoed almost exactly in modern hedonic adaptation research, by the way. Behavioral scientists have found that human beings adapt to almost any pleasurable state remarkably fast, sometimes within days. Whatever you thought would finally satisfy you doesn't, not for long. Not because something's wrong with you. Because that's how the reward system is built. It's built for pursuit, not arrival. So the Buddhist move isn't repression, it's noticing. Watching the craving arise without immediately obeying it. Creating a sliver of space between the impulse and the action. Because in that sliver of space is the only place freedom actually exists. Viktor Frankl said something almost identical, from a totally different tradition, in Man's Search for Meaning. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. He wasn't talking about lust specifically, but it's the exact same architecture. Here's where I want to land this, because I think the culture gives us only 3 bad options. Option 1, repress it. Treat desire as shameful, dangerous, something to be white-knuckled into submission. This is the framework a lot of us inherited, whether from religion or from anxious self-help culture. The problem? What gets repressed doesn't disappear. It goes underground and comes back distorted. Every psychoanalyst from Freud onward has documented this. Suppressed desire has a way of leaking out sideways, showing up in places it doesn't belong. Option 2, indulge it completely. Treat every impulse as sacred, as something to be followed without question, because that's just being authentic. The problem here is subtler, but just as real. You end up perpetually run by the most primitive, least examined part of your own mind. That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of slavery to your own neurochemistry. The third option, the one Maslow was pointing at, the one Buddhist psychology was pointing at, the one Frankl was pointing at, is integration through awareness. It looks like this. You feel the pull. You don't pretend it's not there. You don't panic about it either. You get curious about it. What am I actually reaching for right now? Connection? Validation? Escape? Simple biological hunger? Because very often lust is a costume that a different need is wearing. Loneliness dresses up as lust. Boredom dresses up as lust, desperately trying to get proven wrong by someone else's desire. When you can see the costume, when the raw impulse gets translated into conscious language instead of remaining a wordless pull, something remarkable happens. You get your prefrontal cortex back online. You get to actually choose instead of being narrated to after the fact by a press secretary explaining a decision the lizard already made. And I think this is where lust becomes one of the best teachers you'll ever have about consciousness itself. Not despite how uncomfortable it is, but because of it. Because most of the time, our sense of a stable, unified self is an illusion of convenience. We walk around assuming there's one coherent me making decisions all day. But strong desire states, lust, rage, grief, fear, rip that illusion open for a few minutes and show you the truth. You are a coalition, not a monarchy. Different systems, different themselves, competing for control, and consciousness is less like a king giving orders and more like a parliament arguing in real time about who gets to speak next. The goal isn't to silence any of the voices in that parliament. The goal is to become the kind of person those voices actually trust. Someone who listens to what the desire is pointing toward, without being helplessly dragged by it. Someone who can feel the full force of wanting without losing the thread of who they actually are and what they actually value. That's not repression. That's not indulgence. That's maturity. And it's available to literally anyone willing to get honest about what's actually happening inside them, instead of either shaming it into silence or handing it the keys. So next time that thought walks in uninvited, and it will, try this instead of the usual autopilot. Pause for 1 second, not to fight it, just to see it. Ask what it's actually pointing at underneath. That 1 second is where your whole psychology lives. Let me know in the comments, where do you land on this? Repression, indulgence, or something in between? I read every single one. See you in the next video.